So it's a great pleasure to be here, and I think this is going to be a very complimentary presentation from the point of view of global health and the first speaker from PATH. So, but at the center of what we do is actually to use computation for imaging, sensing, and diagnostic applications for telemedicine and the practice of telemedicine and global health. But I'd like to start my talk with actually this comparison, which is going to hopefully resonate with electrical engineers in the room, which is a comparison of the transistor count in our processors with the megapixel count in cell phones. So essentially, the blue dots here is following the Moore's law, doubling of transistor count in CPUs every almost 2 years. What is surprising here that I'm plotting on the same is the megapixel count of our cell phones starting from 2002 now reached almost more than 40 megapixels at the back of our cell phones. It's been also following the Moore's law, doubling every 2 years. It's not expected to be this way. It's a surprise to me, but it enables us to use the cell phone itself as a very advanced imager so that you can even see individual viruses or bacteria or cells using cell phones. I'll show examples of this in this presentation, but I think this is a great stage to set the power of the cell phones for what we can do. In addition to this, in addition to the hardware, cell phones are actually literally everywhere, and their massive volume creates unique opportunities. We have around 7 billion cell phone subscribers today, and more than 70% of these cell phones are actually being used in developing parts of the world. So you can look at the cell phone as a Swiss Army knife tool, where you can create biomedical imaging, sensing, and diagnostic technologies, and rely on the network, the connectivity, and the hardware and the software, advanced hardware and the software of the cell phone, to really bring in something unique for various different applications needs. And that's exactly the theme of our lab at UCLA. We create new tools for imaging, for microscopy, for sensing, and for diagnostic purposes. And on this slide, you see some of these examples, some of these prototypes. And I'll talk about some of these gadgets today and tell you how they work and what you can do with these. Essentially, literally, you can, with a lightweight and cost-effective attachment, convert your cell phone into a microscope, into a transmission microscope like this, bright field, or a fluorescent one. If you do not want to modify your cell phone, we're looking at standalone devices that are powered through USB and that essentially create a very lightweight and compact microscope that you can use for extreme wide field imaging. Besides microscopic imaging, there are other kinds of designs that you can use the cell phone as actually a detector, as a sensor. In this case, you're looking at actually a smart application and an optomechanical attachment, which goes for albumin detection in urine. For instance, this is an E. coli sensor, which is working based on a sandwich assay and a fluorescent attachment reader, which uses the cell phone to detect E. coli particles in, for instance, milk or water samples. This one is a similar design, a fluorescent and a bright field microscope, but this time it's actually used for blood analysis. It can count for red blood cells, white blood cells, or hemoglobin density of the patient. For triaging in field conditioning, it's going to be quite useful. And then other designs are available. I'd like to draw your attention to this one, which is essentially a diagnostic test reader, which is essentially quite complementary to the previous talk, the OV16 rapid diagnostic test at PATH. This is essentially a universal reader that can quantify, capture images, and quantify rapid diagnostic tests, so that you can actually work with a bunch of diagnostic tests in field conditions and quantify the reports using a smart phone, and then distribute the results using a Google Maps interface so that you can build an epidemiologic tool set for tracking of diseases as a function of space and time. So all of these are being enabled by the current status of the cell phone. Again, the hardware and the software being together. And we value these components a lot because they're cost-effective, lightweight, and compact. But at the same time, there's something more valuable, which is the data. The data that you can capture with these gadgets from wherever they work. And that I think is extremely important because these smart devices form a network, and the network is very, very valuable. I want to emphasize this, but later through my presentation, I'll actually come to the same point again and again. The big data aspect of these networks. But let's come back to some of these gadgets, and I'd like to explain more on how they work and what are some of the unique angles, aspects of these gadgets. So I'd like to start with actually these microscopes that you see here, either the cell phone attachment here or the standalone units, which utilize essentially as the core component the CMOS imager, the same sensor that we have at the back of our cell phones for capturing images. That's the core element here. But these microscopes are not your father's microscope. They're quite different in the sense that they work without the use of any lenses, and they're computational. And that's something we like because cell phones provide us unique access to computation wherever they work. So these are lens-free microscopes. There's no lens in any of these designs. It's quite interesting because you can still see even viruses at the level of a few hundred nanometers. As a result of the fact that they're lens-free, they're compact and cost-effective at the same time, and a unique feature is that they can look at very large volumes, very large areas, which is quite important. And the final thing is that these are tolerant to misalignment. They're not really sensitive to dropping on the floor. They're pretty well designed because they work based on a unique principle that is actually incoherent or partially coherent holograph. So these are holographic lens-free microscopes. Besides telemedicine, you can use these for advanced settings as well, for looking at extremely large areas using non-conventional on-chip lens-free imaging designs. Could be very useful for extremely wide field imaging of, for instance, rare events, rare cells. I won't go into this as much, but when I talk about the platform being independent of the imager, CCD versus CMOS, I'll come back to this point because the variations between CMOS and CCD imagers give us unique opportunities to actually practice different kinds of fields of view and resolution combinations. Let's come back to the principle of lens-free imaging. How can you, without the use of any lenses, see things that are very small, smaller than a micron, a few hundred nanometers, at the scale of a single virus even? Well, that's based on actually imaging of shadows. Since you don't have a lens to form an image, we detect the shadows of specimen. What is different here is that our shadow is pitch dark. It doesn't contain anything useful because we're opaque to light. But if you look at cells, because they're tiny, they let the light penetrate and they cast a unique shadow, which is structured, which contains some texture. So if you were to look at some microscale particles or cells, they would form these unique shadows, which you can treat like the fingerprint. And in this case, you just actually using a CMOS imager with a very simple light-emitting diode, and then place the specimen very close so that they can cast at the single cell level these shadows. If you look at the whole blood, you'll be looking at mostly red blood cells. These are red blood cell shadows. And every now and then you would see white blood cells. So you can use this type of shadow imager as a cytometer. You can count cells. But of course, there are limitations, and I'll address those with some more computation. In a dense sample, these shadows are still okay in different regions, but in denser parts of the sample, you can't really understand what's going on because of the overlap. But these shadows are actually not just dummy shadows. They are containing interference of light in the form of digital holograms that you can actually reconstruct them and time reverse optical fields using a computer or using a processor in your cell phone. And take an image like this and reconstruct it using Fourier optics principles to get back to the plane of the cells. These are red blood cells, as if you have a regular microscope looking through an eyepiece or looking through an objective lens. So you can get the same performance without the lens entirely through computation. It becomes compact, lightweight, at the same time extremely cost-effective. This is just an introduction. I'll show you some more competitive results. This is just a warm-up. Whether it's running on a cell phone, using the cell phone CMOS imager at the back, or a standalone device, the same CMOS as we have in our cell phones, or for extreme field of view, extreme throughput, a CCD that you would find, let's say, in a telescope. All these work based on the same principles of partially coherent holography. It's not based on standard traditional holography that we're accustomed to seeing using a laser, because we do not like lasers. They have too much coherence and they have speckle and multiple reflection interference type of noise terms. That's why we like to use partially coherent light. Actually, we use LEDs, light emitting diodes. They work very nicely. So there's some very nice physics behind this, which enable us to actually, even with incoherent or partially coherent light, to reconstruct images of cells with a very large field of view. So I'd like to encourage you to go back, if you're interested in the physics of this, to some of our publications. We've recently actually used even the sunlight itself to reconstruct these shadows. And like any other holographic technique, there's some back-end processing that's going on to get from these holograms to the image. I won't go into the details, but there is some iterative reconstruction processes that takes a few milliseconds, very fast, to go from a hologram to the real image by eliminating the twin image noise. And this is one example where essentially this shows you the loop, the iteration, that you time reverse to get actually the phase that is missed in a hologram. So because everything is intensity, we miss the phase of the optical field that we sampled at the CMOS, and that phase is crucial for us to time reverse. That's why the first step is very quickly get the missing phase that the intensity has to have to form a complex field which we can time reverse in a computer. And after this, you can go back to the image very quickly using basically mostly FFT, fast Fourier transform-based reconstruction codes. So whether it's running, again, on a CMOS or a CCD, we're recovering the optical phase and then time reversing the fields to go from these weird-looking shadows of the cells and then recover the phase. Once you have both, you can go to the cell plane, and these are subcellular features of some white blood cells, and these are platelets. I'll start showing you some lower resolution images first, but later I'll tell you tricks how you can push the resolution to deeply submicron, because certain applications, such as looking for malaria parasites in a thin smear, require high resolution and wide field microscopy. I'll tell you tricks how you can actually go to higher resolution to capture better images, which provide a match to a higher resolution objective lens, higher macro aperture objective lens, but without the objective lens itself. These are reconstructions, red blood cells, some E. coli particles, some waterborne parasites, and everything you compare to a conventional microscope to see if you've imaged really apples for apples. And because everything is digital, you can also make this work as a blood analyzer for counting and looking at cell densities per microliter using a very inexpensive and field portable design as shown here. I'd like to highlight one application of such lower resolution microscopes, in the sense that this microscope that I've shown here is equivalent to a 10x objective lens. I'll tell you tricks how we can make it equivalent to a 100x objective in the next few slides. But let's first start simple and seek solutions that this kind of a simple microscope, a resolution on the order of 1 to 2 micrometers, not submicron, but very large field of view, of course, extremely field portable, how this could even be useful without the submicron resolution. One example that I'd like to highlight here is actually monitoring of HIV-positive patients, because for an HIV-positive patient, the CD4 lymphocyte count is quite important. We have typically more than 1,000 of CD4s per microliter of our blood, but once HIV kicks in, that number drops to a few hundred. And according to the World Health Organization, every 3 months you have to sample the CD4 count of the patient. That's of course expensive, because the gold standard for this is a flow cytometer. They're relatively bulky and expensive, and there are efforts to miniaturize flow cytometers, but still the running costs $5 to $10 per test are prohibitive for certain resource-poor settings. So what we've done is we've combined these field-portable microscopes that work based on shadows with spatial microfluidic devices that have surface chemistry on them, so that they can, from whole blood, specifically and sensitively capture a certain subpopulation of white blood cells. It's a generic platform. You can do this for E. coli capture from urine or water, or CD4 capture from blood. In this case, if you, there is some surface chemistry. If you inject whole blood and wash it out. You would be only selectively capturing these CD4s, which can then be imaged based on their shadows and counted to give you a count for microliter of blood. We've done this for both CD4 lymphocytes and CD8 lymphocytes because we would like to find the ratio of these cells. For instance, this is looking at one of these microfluidic devices, imaged using a lens-free microscope as shown. And maybe because of the poor contrast, you won't be able to see this, but there are microspots here. Each one of these microspots, if you zoom in, will show you these holograms. Then you reconstruct and get the cells, which are then counted per spot. On the same chip, these are the zoomed-in images. There are CD4 antibody spots and CD8 antibody spots. So they are reconstructed to get the ratio of CD4 to CD8, which is an important metric because that's when, if that ratio is below a certain threshold, you can start antiretroviral therapy. We found that actually for healthy patients, that ratio is high. CD4 to CD8 is on the order of 2 to 3. But once HIV kicks in, that ratio drops to subunity, and that's when essentially opportunistic infections could be quite detrimental. So that's when the immunity of the patient is quite low. This gives you a good example where even a lower resolution microscope that has a numerical aperture of 0.1 on the order of 1 to 2 micron resolution could be quite useful to specifically image and count these cells, taking the function of a cytometer essentially in your pocket. There are different versions of the same technology. You can even use nanoparticles, plasmonic metallic nanoparticles, to specifically label different cells, and then their shadows are modulated. So in this example, we're looking at the same problem of CD4 to CD8 differentiation, but this time using gold and silver nanoparticles. So gold labels CD4s, and silver nanoparticles label CD8 lymphocytes, and everything is still shadow imaging, except these nanoparticles scatter differently for different wavelengths, so you can separate them even using these simple holograms. So there are different versions of the same idea of how you can use a lower resolution microscope for cytometry purposes for, in this case, diagnostics. And of course, water quality screening is another application for these microscopes. I'll skip this part because there are different technologies that I'll introduce, but because water screening requires large volumes to be imaged, lens-free imaging provides a unique advantage because lens-free imaging has a very large field of view. For instance, this design, although it's got a limited resolution on the order of 1 to 2 microns, it has a field of view that's on the order of 24 millimeters square. The nice thing about lens-free imaging is the CMOS active area, whatever it is your imaging field of view. Typically, your cell phones have 20 to 30 millimeters square, and next year maybe they will be 40 millimeters square. That's the area where you can image a specimen with a decent resolution. In that regard, the real advantage here is the large volume, the large depth of field, large field of view that these microscopes can screen for. And quite useful for, again, looking for rare events, whether it's an E. coli particle or a cell in the sample. Now, in the next few slides, I'd like to go over some more technology that is going to keep this field of view as competitive as it is, scaling linearly with the active area of the sensor. However, increase the resolution and the numerical aperture so that we are now more competitive for the resolution, deeply submicron. So for that, we've complicated the design, but still very cost-effective and lightweight. So from a design that uses a single light-emitting diode at the top, where you load your sample from the side here, and this is the USB port. Now we've complicated the design as shown here, a taller design, but still very lightweight. Less than 120 grams in total. So if you look inside, what you see in this design is a bunch of light-emitting diodes. Instead of a single one, now we use some 20 of these light-emitting diodes. Each light-emitting diode is a very inexpensive commodity. It's on the order of a few cents, even if you buy it in low quantities, a few tens of cents. So you load your specimen from the side, and at a given time, only one LED is on, and this CMOS imager here, which is, let's say, a 5 megapixel imager, the previous generation, records a hologram for a given LED. Then the LED starts to shift in the sense that we turn on different LEDs at a given time. Every time there's a single hologram that's being recorded. However, because of the location change, holograms digitally shift. So we can actually synthesize a pixel super resolved hologram that has a much better, much finer pixel size than actually the CMOS has. This is the same technology borrowed from security cameras. If you're in an airport and looking at a security camera that's far away from you, your face is pixelated and you can't resolve the fine features. But if you're walking away and staring at the same camera, then you would be recording a video where every frame of this video has a different perspective or different shift with respect to the previous frames. You can take these 10 to 15 frames and synthesize what we call a super resolved image of your face. The fact here is that the larger pixel size on this image has been actually divided into smaller subpixels to give you a finer resolution. This is exactly what we do, except there's nothing moving here, just the LEDs turning on and off. This gives us a higher resolution without sacrificing the field of view. Now the holograms contain higher oscillations. These are corresponding to higher numerical apertures. And if you reconstruct them, you can see deeply submicron features of the specimen that were normally washed away in a single hologram. Why do we care about this? Because we want to look at large areas. So if you're using a state-of-the-art CMOS, this one is a CMOS imager that you have in your recent generation Samsung Galaxy phones, very high-end CMOS manufactured by Sony. This is actually around 12 megapixels, and it has a 1.1 micron pixel size, but it can give you around 1 billion useful pixels with a resolution of on the order of 250 nanometers, almost diffraction limited. So it gives you, these are some focused ion beam milling results where to verify the resolution, we looked at some nanoscale lines here. This is a very large field of view, a conventional microscope objective with a similar numerical aperture. We'll be looking at a small area of this entire field of view. That's one example where the space bandwidth product, the information capacity of the imager, has been significantly increased. And this is, of course, important because if you're looking at blood smears for looking at morphology of red blood cells, to understand if the red blood cell morphology is abnormal due to, for instance, a parasite invading the red blood cell, then you're looking at extremely rare patterns. In the case of malaria parasite, malaria diagnostics using, for instance, thin blood smears investigated through microscopy, you're looking at around 1%. The peristemia is on the order of 1% or less. That's why you need to take an image like this, a very large scale bar here, and then using a microscope, scan this to really call it for negatives. That's where, again, a computational microscope has the advantage because you can, from all the way from one part of the diagonal to the other, you can reconstruct and get very nice submicron resolution images of the cells across a very large field of view, which is around 2 orders of magnitude wider than a similar objective lens. So these are some malaria parasites. Essentially, this is a conventional objective lens. This purple-looking thing is a parasite invading a red blood cell. This is how it looks under a lens-free microscope. You see the same invasion in the phase image reconstructed by this field-portable super-resolution microscope. Of course, the advantage being very large fields of view. Typically, 20 millimeter square is standard. 30 millimeter square is also feasible, again, with submicron resolution. There are also different ways of doing this reconstruction. This is actually a color microscope. One of my students is presenting this work tomorrow around noontime. Alon will present this work. So I won't go into the details, but if you are interested in how you can also create a color imager, lens-free color imager, based on the same lens-free holographic technology, you should see his presentation, again, around noontime tomorrow. These are some pap smear images that are created by the same microscope. Pap smear is used for diagnosis, early stage diagnosis of cervical cancer. So these are good examples where very large field of view has been reconstructed, and the pathologist will be looking at mostly the ratio between the nucleus and the cytoplasm. These dark-looking things are nuclear features on the slide. Again, a very large resolution and a very large field of view. Very good resolution and very large field of view at the same time. These are captured using, again, CMOS imagers of your cell phone. If you don't want to stick to just the CMOS, then you can change the scale bar to even a centimeter. So if you're looking at CCD-based imagers, then you can even go for extreme field of view. In this case, you're looking at 1800 millimeters square. So it's really around 3 orders of magnitude wider, because this is essentially a very large format CCD. And these are some sperm samples being imaged, reconstructed based on their holograms. And you see these submicron tails of the sperms here and their conventional microscope comparisons across a very, very large area. A microscope would be looking at this tiny white circle here with a similar resolution. That's where the throughput is great. But that's also an important point that I'd like to highlight here. That is decoupling between field of view and resolution. In a conventional microscope, whenever you want to go for higher resolution, you immediately sacrifice field of view. There's a trade-off between field of view and resolution. These microscopes break that trade-off because they decouple resolution and field of view. Another way of saying this is a 12 megapixel imager. Has a certain pitch size, 1.1 micron in this case. It gives us a very large numerical aperture, almost diffraction limited. Next year, if the manufacturer gives us, instead of 12 megapixels, 20 megapixels, I will keep my resolution the same, but almost double my field of view. The more megapixels you put in, the larger the field of view will be without sacrificing the resolution. And if the design of the imager becomes even better with smaller pitch size and more megapixels, I can potentially improve both resolution and field of view at the same time, which is quite unique, again, for computational imaging. And these microscopes can actually even see individual viruses with the help of certain nano lenses. So this is something that I won't go into the details, but around nanoparticles, you can self-assemble polymer lenses, nano lenses, so that it can help visualizing individual nanoparticles, sub-100 nanometer objects across a very large field of view. A field of view that exactly is the same as the active area of your CMOS. The science behind this is self-assembly of nano lenses around individual particles. It's essentially the same science that we used to play as a kid. If you take 2 rings, dip them into a soap solution, and take them out, you would find this thin membrane of soap self-assembled. This is exactly what you would get by playing with soap and some rings. This functional form here is a catenoid. It's a minimal surface, and it's exactly what is happening at the nanoscale around individual nanoparticles here. If you cut this in half, that shape self-assembles around a nanoparticle so that we can visualize across a very large field of view. These are some examples where you're looking at H1N1 particles, individual particles, being reconstructed across a very large field of view. These are technologies that you can leverage for instance, viral load measurements. Using some disposable microchips that are specifically functionalized for certain viruses, you can actually determine the viral load patient with these disposable lens-free imager-based technologies that you can take, again, into your pocket for field imaging. Everything that I've shown you so far was bright field and holographic. So there was no label. There was the specificity was coming from surface functionalization, either of a microfluidic device or certain nanoparticles, so that you bring in specificity and sensitivity to your imaging system. But there are also other kinds of designs that we played with. And fluorescent microscopy or cytometry is another example where you can leverage the cell phone and its imaging power, its optics, to really create some very unique designs for fluorescent imaging. Fluorescence is very important because it has natural specificity to it, and that's why it's frequently used for diagnostic purposes. What you're looking at here is a cell phone attachment that converts a cell phone into a wide field fluorescent microscope. The nice design here is that the sample itself is acting like a waveguide. The sample, which might contain, let's say, a water sample or a blood sample that you've labeled certain things, and you want to count what is fluorescing, that's going to tell you some number, whether you shouldn't drink that water or not, or whether your blood cell count is too low or too high. That sample itself, which is disposable from our point of view, is also acting like a waveguide. It actually collects the emission, the excitation light, which is delivered by these LEDs, These blue LEDs, they're providing the excitation. But the excitation is guided within the microfluidic device. And that's why we can use a very inexpensive filter on the order of $1 to reject this scattered light. And it gives us a very nice dark field contrast. And this is, for instance, a whole blood sample where you're looking at white blood cells labeled, and everything else, whether or not they're red blood cells, platelets, they're silent because they're not labeled. And these are some waterborne parasites in drinking water that you can label and image with these microscopes. And the signature for this is very wide field of view because we want to look for rare events. Instead of capturing a static image, you can also capture a dynamic movie. In this case, you're looking at a movie where these things that are being counted are white blood cells that are labeled, and they're now being counted as they flow, from which you can understand the density of these white blood cells. If you integrate, for instance, across 2 minutes of one of these movies, you get a very nice fit to a hematology analyzer looking at the same blood samples. And these are some different versions of the same design. Without any flow, using an Android application, you can not only capture these images, but process them and give a report right using the cell phone without any supercomputer of the field, and it reports essentially, in this case, red blood cells, white blood cells, and hemoglobin density all together. So I've talked about different designs and different ways that you can use the cell phone itself as a means for performing high-end microscopy to the level where you can routinely see single viruses that are attached to a surface, or using the cell phone itself as a fluorescent imager. But I'd like to come back to this slide that I've showed at the very beginning of my presentation, which is a comparison of the Moore's law versus the megapixel count in cell phones. And again, it's following the same doubling trend every 2 years, which is quite surprising. But I'd like to draw your attention to this final point here, which is at the top of the pixel curve. That one is a 40 megapixel imager from Nokia. It's one of those beautiful imagers. But that imager enabled us a very unique design where we can, using an interesting microscope design as shown here, we can routinely see fluorescent nanoparticles and viruses at the single particle, single virus level. That's a milestone for the cell phone itself in fluorescence, because fluorescence from a nanoparticle is very, very small, because a nanoparticle, by definition, is on the order of, let's say, 100 nanometers. It's below the diffraction limit. It's smaller than half the wavelength, and it doesn't emit a lot of light, because you're talking about labeling, which is not a lot of molecules there. But the state for the cell phone has reached to this level where you can use that with a laser diode, which excites the specimen with an angle. This is a spatial angle because we do not want the scattered laser light to come into the detector. We want to use inexpensive filters, and most of the excitation light is actually simply exiting the imaging field of view, imaging numerical aperture. And then you can use the cell phone itself to capture fluorescent images which contain a very high signal-to-noise ratio and contrast to the level where we can actually see individual viruses. These are some viral particles that are being compared to a confocal microscope. So now the comparison is essentially a photon counting confocal microscope. And that is enabled by essentially the Moore's law, helping us, even though it's very compact and cost-effective, the performance that's embedded in the cell phone is very unique and very powerful to give us unique imager designs, unique microscope designs, and sensor designs that could be essentially leveraged in field settings. I'd like to also disclose here a conflict of interest. I'm a co-founder of a startup company, Holomic, and that's based in Los Angeles. And some of these designs are also already commercially available. One example that I'd like to give you is this universal rapid diagnostic test reader, which is essentially a platform for reading and quantifying different lateral flow tests. It's not a commercial entity where whatever you use for malaria diagnosis or HIV tests or other sexually transmitted diseases or OV16, you can actually use these for quantifying very accurately whether it's a nanoparticle-based lateral flow test or a fluorescent-based lateral flow test. You can quantify these using these attachments. With this, I'd like to conclude, and once again, thank you very much for your invitation and for your attention.